One of the central facts of American political life that cannot be denied is that income inequality has massively increased. It was already quite extreme prior to the pandemic, but during the pandemic, a huge number of small businesses disappeared, and the mega corporations and the multi-billionaires who own and control them consolidated a huge amount of commerce in their hands, especially internet platforms when people felt they couldn't go outside. And as a result, those people got even richer, and the gap between the richest people in our country and pretty much everybody else grew even further. Now, when that happens, and lots of people have different opinions about to what extent that inequality should be able to grow, maybe it should be able to grow for as much as it wants and can. Maybe the government should intervene in some way. Whatever your view on that is, there's no question, and even the founders often stress this, that if income inequality becomes too large, if wealth inequality becomes too great, then inevitably it will spill over, said the founders, people like Thomas Paine, even Thomas Jefferson talked about this, it will spill over, that inequality will, into the realm of political rights and our political processes, which are intended to be not based on who has greater wealth, but just equal among every citizen. And that is absolutely what has been happening over the last 20 to 30 years. I actually talked on the after show yesterday about my original support in 2010 for the majority ruling in Citizens United on First Amendment grounds, and I explained why I still agree with that ruling. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean, simply because I oppose First Amendment restrictions as a solution, that this is not a huge problem. It is a massive problem. It's getting bigger, and it's essentially rendering in some cases, our democracy illusory. Because even the politicians who want to be the most independent, want to be the most heterodox, the most anti-establishment, end up relying on just a handful of multi-billionaires who finance their campaign with gargantuan sums of money. They then feel captive to those people and their agenda, even if they don't necessarily want to follow or agree with that agenda. And then even once the election is over, it's the wealthiest corporations and the wealthiest people who pay for the lobbyists and pay for the processes that shape the actual laws that Congress passes, often the same people who finance it getting the same outcomes. Now, one of the people who has broken records this year in terms of the amount of money she has given to support a single candidate, Donald Trump, by donating $100 million to a super PAC that is supposed to be independent of the campaign, but that supports Trump's election, is named Miriam Adelson. And she is Israeli-born. She spent a lot of her life, most of her life, as an Israeli citizen. She never gave up her Israeli citizenship. She's now also an American citizen by virtue of having married her multi-billionaire husband in 1991. And here's the Wall Street Journal yesterday explaining exactly what it is that she's doing in this election cycle. Quote, conservative donor Miriam Adelson gives a super PAC supporting Donald Trump $95 million. Quote, Adelson, who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Trump in 2018, supplied all but $81,000 of the money that the President Preserve America PAC took in during the third quarter, according to the filing Tuesday with the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And in reality, it ended up being $100 million. She had given $5 million in seed money to that PAC, so in total, she did what she promised she would do, which is donate $100 million to a super PAC trying to elect Donald Trump. And you see mega donors on both sides, on both parties, getting closer and closer to that number as well. Elon Musk has given something similar in that same universe, though somewhat less. And there's plenty of billionaires funding the Democratic Party and long have been, including one that we'll talk about, who's very similar in trajectory and belief to Miriam Adelson. But her wealth comes from an inheritance that she received when her husband, whom she married later in his life, Sheldon Adelson, died at the age of 87 back in 2021, as the Financial Times reported then. U.S. casino magnate and Republican donor Sheldon Adelson dies at 87. Billionaire helped transform gaming hubs and wield influence over U.S. and Israeli politics. Quote, Adelson was the billionaire founder of Las Vegas Sands and is credited with transforming the cities of Las Vegas and Macau into gaming and resort destinations. He leveraged his vast wealth to exert social and political influence on causes from Jewish affairs to combating opioid addiction, bought regional newspapers in Nevada and Israel, and befriended world leaders around the globe. And I should say that Miriam Adelson is actually a physician. She became a physician, an emergency room physician, but then also an internist prior to marrying Sheldon Adelson. And it's true that her specialty before she married him was working on opioid addicts in particular, and the physiological struggles they face, both in terms of their addiction and then withdrawing from it. So that's a very genuine cause that both of them supported. But, quote, most recently, Adelson was a close confidant of U.S. President Donald Trump and wielded power behind the scenes, including successfully urging Mr. Trump to push for the relocation of the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Adelson and his wife, Miriam, were among the deepest pocketed and most reliable donors to Republican political candidates in recent years. As the single largest Republican donor in the 2012 election cycle, Adelson's endorsement of Mr. Trump for president early in the 2016 campaign helped accelerate the New York businessman's route to the White House. The couple maintained their position in the upper echelon of Republican donors through subsequent elections, including the 2018 midterms. The Center for Responsive Politics, which tracks campaign contributions, ranked the Adelsons as the largest individual donors of the 2020 election cycle, given almost $220 million, all of it to Republicans. Adelson helped support Ariel University, built on a settlement deep inside the occupied West Bank, and was a guest of honor at the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem in 2019. At the ceremony, American and Israeli dignitaries made a beeline for him and his wife, who is now expected to take over his pro-Israel philanthropy. And that's exactly what she has done. She's become arguably the single most influential person in financing one of the candidates in this election cycle. Now, as I said, I think anytime billionaires are donating massive amounts of wealth, and it's legal for them to do it, and they're not doing anything wrong, but I think our political liberties and our political system gets corrupted by having a handful, a tiny number of people be able to basically mold and shape the political parties and candidates to their agenda, oftentimes having both political parties mold to their agenda through the use of their vast wealth, just multi-billions of dollars and flowing in an unlimited way. She could have given $1 billion to Trump if she wanted. There are no limits on how much you can give, but it's particularly strange when the people who are doing the most to shape your politics weren't born in the United States and have a citizenship in a country that is not the United States, which is in Miriam Adelson's case in Israel. She is an Israeli citizen, that's where she was born. And where she goes around saying quite unabashedly and proudly that her primary political issue is making sure the United States does everything Israel wants and needs to serve the interests of Israel and the Israeli people. And just imagine if we had a oligarchical Russian couple spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year in our election cycle while maintaining Russian citizenship with the sole overarching goal of making sure the United States government and its policies serves the interest of the Russian people. Or imagine any country sending one of their wealthiest people to just become an American citizen and pour hundreds of millions of dollars into our policies and into our politicians to ensure that those politicians and those parties stay loyal and faithful to the interests of the other country to which they have citizenship and therefore loyalty and where they were born. It would never be acceptable in any other instance other than a citizen of Israel exercising this amount of power in this way. Here from Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, in January of 2021, quote, "The fate of Adelson's political empire lies in the hands of his Israeli widow, Miriam." And that's how she's always referred to as the Israeli Miriam Adelson, his Israeli widow. Quote, "Miriam Adelson was often credited with increasing the late Sheldon Adelson's interest in Israel. Right-wing politicians will be watching to see what happens next." Quote, "Miriam Adelson surely never saw herself as an American kingmaker when she was growing up in Israel. Born in British Mandatory Palestine in 1946 to Manuka and Sima Farbstein, who fled Eastern Europe just prior to the Holocaust, she grew up in Haifa, where her father ended up owning several movie theaters. She spent 2 years in the Israeli army, earned a Bachelor of Science degree in microbiology and genetics from the Hebrew University and a medical degree from Tel Aviv University. Later, she became the chief internist in an ER at the since-shuttered Rochak Hospital in Tel Aviv. She met the then 57-year-old Adelson on a blind date in 1991, and they were married within 100 days of that first meeting. So credit to her and kudos to her for not just finding a husband and getting him to marry her within basically 3 months, but finding one of the richest people on the planet worth, according to Forbes, $30 billion to do so. You can't do anything other than stand back and on some level admire that, regardless of how damaging the outcome was. The article goes on, quote, she told Fortune magazine in 2012 that she, quote, got stuck in the United States after meeting Sheldon, the love of my life. In a 2008 New Yorker article entitled The Brass Ring that took a deep dive into Sheldon Adelson's influence when his dominance of the business and political realms was becoming clearer, journalist Connie Brooke wrote that according to those who knew him well, it was Miriam who intensified her husband's commitment to Israel and shifted his political views substantially to the right. It is highly unlikely, for instance, that a Miriam-free Sheldon Adelson would have made such massive contributions to causes like the Holocaust Museum and Memorial, the Birthright Israel Program, Friends of the IDF, the Zionist Organization of America, AIPAC, and more recently the Israel-American Council and the Anti-Defamation League. And without her, it is unlikely he would be so deeply involved with Israeli politics and politicians, most prominently Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or would have founded the pro-Netanyahu Israeli Hayam Free Daily newspaper, of which Miriam is also the publisher. So they weren't just using their massive wealth inside the United States to ensure that the United States and both political parties remains aligned with and loyal to the interests of the Israeli government. Even policies that the United States has long opposed but are now becoming almost forced to accept and even support, such as the annexation of the West Bank by Israel, which the United States has long regarded as deeply detrimental to American interests, but which is one of the main policies that Sheldon and Miriam Adelson both want. That's why he was funding settlements deep within the West Bank, because those settlements, those Israeli settlements, make a two-state solution impossible. It means that the West Bank will be ruled by Israel, either through annexation or now through essentially apartheid. Here is the New York Times, who did a profile on Miriam Adelson when she announced her intent to spend $100 million on a pro-Trump super PAC. The headline was, "The pro-Israel donor with a $100 million plan to elect Trump." Miriam Adelson long operated in the shadow of her powerful husband, Sheldon Adelson. Now, after her death, she is playing in politics as a sole practitioner for the first time. And the article reads, quote, Dr. Adelson is poised to become one of the biggest donors in the presidential election, and if Mr. Trump wins, one of the most powerful private citizens with a say in American foreign policy. Fiercely hawkish on Israel, she was deeply unnerved by the Hamas attacks on October 7th and would likely shape a second Trump administration's posture on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I have questions about whether that's true, but of course, the New York Times says it wants to convince people that it is, and certainly, while I have more doubts and questions, obviously it's possible, very possible, that if you give one candidate $100 million to get them elected, and then they go around with you everywhere promising to give you everything that you want, as Trump has been doing over the last year, there's going to be some captivity, some debt. People don't spend $100 million and expect to get nothing in return. The article goes on, quote, "She is in some ways a political carbon copy of her husband, intensely pro-Israel, rabidly partisan, and a believer in the nobility of using her money, north of $30 billion, and her media empire to buy, influence, and shape the world. But she is also, by the accounts of people who have pitched her, a tougher ask. She is seen as more cerebral and disciplined than her husband, whereas Mr. Adelson enjoyed the game of politics and obsessed over tactics. He wasn't above editing the script of the advertisement," one of the people said. "She is more driven by whatever is happening in America and Israeli news. Her fervor for Mr. Trump," some of his allies say, "actually exceeds her late husband's. At one point, she suggested adding a, quote, book of Trump to the Bible. Her Israeli nationalism has tethered her to Mr. Trump, especially since October 7th. Her Israeli nationalism is what is fueling her desire and her attempt and her success, given the virtually incomparable wealth she has. There are only a few people on the planet richer than she. That's what's driving her attempt to shape American politics, to shape the Republican Party. And like I said, there are plenty of people doing exactly the same thing on the Democratic side, not just funding them with their billionaire wealth, but funding them for the same goal, the same purpose, the same policy in mind, to make sure the Democratic Party also stays aligned with and loyal to the state of Israel. Now, the Adelsons have not just been funding Trump, they've been funding the Republican Party for many years with incomparable levels of donations and wealth, and they make very clear that in order to get their money, the main hoop that you have to jump through is promising repeatedly that you will be loyal to Israel and to prove that you actually mean it. And if you're running for president, especially in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party, your tendency politically is that you're going to pledge loyalty to Israel. But when someone's sitting there with tens, or in the case of Trump this year, $100 million, and saying all you have to do is spout the most pro-Israel slogans and then convince me that you mean it and that you'll carry through on it, then obviously that's going to have a major impact. Here from NBC News in September of this year, quote, it's not just the quote, Adelson primary. That's what it's called. It's called the Adelson primary, where Republican candidates compete to see who gets their support, returns as Republicans gather in Las Vegas. Mega donor Miriam Adelson met with a handful of prominent Republican politicians and hyped Trump, who she said she is trying to help return to the White House. For, quote, years, an informal process of the Adelson primary took place that brought politicians to meet with billionaire casino magnate Sheldon Adelson, founder of the Las Vegas Sands Casino and one of the party's largest financiers. The importance of the Adelsons never diminished. Miriam Adelson has had a bit of a different approach since Sheldon Adelson's passing, but the mission remains the same, said a longtime Republican operative familiar with the family's thinking. Quote, she is always going to preserve his legacy and do its best to protect the United States and our greatest ally, Israel. During the three-day annual RJC summit, Miriam Adelson met with prominent Republican politicians, including Montana Senator Steve Dines, who this election cycle runs the National Republican Senatorial Committee, Florida Senator Rick Scott, who is running to become Senate Republican leader, and Florida Representatives Byron Donalds and Mick Waltz, both of whom were considering runs for governor in Florida in 2026. Quote, every policymaker that wants to ascend in the Republican Party knows that a relationship with the Adelsons is key, the Republican operative said. 20 years ago, nobody knew what the RJC was. That's the Republican Jewish Conference. And today you have state house members tripping over themselves to try and go to the Vegas event. Now, just to give you an indication of how deep this wealth goes, Miriam Adelson is also the owner of the NBA team, the Dallas Mavericks, which her son-in-law is the general manager of and runs that team for her. I mean, it's just wealth of a kind that's unimaginable and basically infinite. In May of this year, New York Magazine published an article entitled Miriam Adelson's Unfinished Business. What does the 8th richest woman in the world want? Quote, when she met her late husband, the casino magnate Sheldon Adelson, in the late 1980s, she was a divorced addiction doctor who had left Tel Aviv for New York to pursue a research fellowship on methadone treatment. She had dedicated her life to lifting up the weak, but like almost all Israelis of her generation, the protection of the Jewish people, the security of the state of Israel is her true calling. So after she married Sheldon in 1991, she leaned in. As Cicero put it, endless money forms the sinews of war. Money to the American Israel Political Action Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. Money to the Zionist Organization of America. Money to the Republican Jewish Committee. So much money up and down the ballot and across the globe that a candidate's position on Israeli foreign policy, that is a candidate's position on a tiny country that most voters cared about not at all, determine the size of their campaign war chest. Many political fundraising experts, including Craig Holman, Public Citizen's chief ethics lobbyist, believe Adelson will be Trump's top patron in 2024 as she was in 2020. What will she expect in return? Beyond unconditional support for the Israel-Hamas war, one can assume she'll press for the unfinished items of Trump's Israel agenda from the last term. At the top of that list, Israel annexing the West Bank and the U.S. recognizing Israeli sovereignty there. Something that, again, even the most devoutly pro-Israel presidents of the last 3 decades in both parties strongly argued. This is true of Reagan and Bush 41 and Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Barack Obama, that it was vital to American national security that Israel not annex the West Bank, because annexing the West Bank means there would never be a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which causes a great deal of anti-American hatred in the region, and also prevents the United States from doing what they want to do in the Middle East, because no one will partner with them in that region as long as they're seen supporting Israel when the Palestinians don't have a homeland. Trump said on camera, quote, I'm a very loyal person. I've been the best president in history to Israel by a factor of 10 because all the things I do, the embassy, Jerusalem being the capital, then you have Golan Heights. Nobody ever thought that was going to be possible. I did that. Miriam Adelson, as I said, she doesn't give away her money for free. She gets everything she wants. Here's just one symbolic present that Trump gave her in November of 2018. He gave her the Medal of Honor, the highest honor that an American, private American citizen can receive. Now, this is something that Miriam Adelson is very proud of. She loves to go around and boast of all the things she made Trump do for her and for Israel. She goes around handing him buckets of money, and then she stands up and she says, look at all the things that I got him for do to Israel, and look at all the things he's going to still continue to give to Israel if he's elected. Here is Miriam Adelson in August of this year, at a Trump rally, speaking with both American and Israeli flags behind her.
That president is Donald Trump. He promised to recognize Jerusalem and to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Promise kept. He promised to withdraw from Iran nuclear deal. And promise kept. He promised to bring peace between Israel and Arab nations. Promise kept. And Golan Heights, that was a big gift. He promised Golan Heights, and he recognized. And all of this he did in his first term while battling COVID pandemic, race riots, and the liberal media. Now I want to tell you, politicians make promises. Real leaders keep promises.
So that's just her boasting of how she used her money to extract a bunch of commitments from Trump to benefit Israel. And she says, even while the country was suffering from COVID, even while he was battling the liberal media, he still found time to do all these things we demanded that he do and that he promised he would do for Israel in exchange for our money. And Donald Trump himself, speaking last month before the Israeli-American Council, almost mocked the situation in the very Trumpian style that he has, basically saying, you know what, the Adelsons, there's no giving them enough, there's no satiating them. Whatever you give them, whatever you give to Israel, they come back and want more and more and more. And he basically said, and that's what I'm going to do for them. Here's him speaking at this event where she was also present.
Just as I promised, I recognized Israel's eternal capital and opened the American embassy in Jerusalem. Jerusalem became the capital. I also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. You know, Miriam and Sheldon would come into the White House probably almost more than anybody outside of people that work there. And they were always after, and as soon as I'd give them something, always for Israel. As soon as I'd give them something, they'd want something else. I said, give me a couple of weeks, will you please? But I gave them the Golan Heights, and they never even asked for it. You know, for 72 years, they've been trying to do the Golan Heights, right? And even Sheldon didn't have the nerve. But I said, you know what? I said to David Friedman, give me a quick lesson, like 5 minutes or less on the Golan Heights. And he did. And I said, let's do it. We got it done in about 15 minutes, right? Yeah.
So just to be clear, what Trump's version of events is that he had no idea what the Golan Heights was. He didn't know anything about it. It's a disputed territory that the Syrians, the Lebanese, and Israelis claim belongs to them. It's a very strategic part of land. It's a very strategic part land, and Israel has been arguing with their neighbors over who controls the Golan Heights. It's something that Israel is occupying and wants to take fully. And Trump said, here's what I did. I asked David Friedman, who was his ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Israel, to give him a 5-minute lesson. David Friedman is one of the most fanatical Zionists you will ever find. And whatever David Friedman told him about the Golan Heights and what it is, Trump immediately says that he voluntarily stood up and announced to do something for Israel that not even Sheldon Adelson had the nerve to ask for, which is to just hand over the Golan Heights to Israel, to just recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And Miriam Adelson, that was one of the things that she listed as something he promised the Adelsons and then followed through on. Now, one of the things that the Adelsons have been doing for a long time is recognizing what they regard as the danger on American college campuses and the growing belief among young Americans and young college students that U.S. support for Israel is damaging to our interest and is also immoral. And back in 2018, even before that, the Adelsons announced that they were going to invest massive funding into battling anti-Israel sentiment on American colleges' campuses. From the Times of Israel in August of 2018, quote, Adelson-backed college activist group to double presence to 80 campuses. The Maccabee Task Force, which works to counter the BDS movement at universities, will also begin operating in Canada for the first time. So one of the things they've been wanting to do is to strip away criticism of Israel on American college campuses and make sure that pro-Israel sentiment reigns there as well, something that we saw manifest this year over the controversies on college campuses. Now, just to be clear about one thing, although the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem had long been considered a sort of pro-Israel, radical pro-Israel move, one that most of the world was against because Jerusalem is considered disputed and was supposed to be part of the settlement that would bring peace to the Israelis and Palestinians by carving up that land and having some be part of the Israeli state and some being part of the Palestinian state because Jerusalem was disputed. Recognizing it as Israel's capital, putting your embassy there is essentially taking it for Israel and handing over to them, which is something that Donald Trump promised the Adelsons he would do and then did. And the Democrats were about to try and turn this into some sort of controversy until they realized that the top level leadership of the Democratic Party also supported the movement of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv and the recognition of Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. Here from National Review in May of 2018, quote, Chuck Schumer praises Trump for the embassy move. Quote, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, praised President Trump Monday for his, quote, long overdue relocation of the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Quote, it's a long overdue move because we have moved our embassy to Jerusalem, he said in a statement. Quote, every nation should have the right to choose its capital. I sponsored legislation to do this 2 decades ago, and I applaud President Trump for doing it. Why don't we just declare our capital, the American capital, Moscow, and then we can just demand that every country in the world recognize Moscow as the American capital, demand that they move all their embassies and ambassadors to the United States to Moscow, and we'll just declare it our own. Every country has a right to do that. Now, one of the reasons the Democrats are so aligned with the Adelsons and with Donald Trump in being almost entirely as pro-Israel as the Adelsons want Trump to be is because they have their own billionaires spending similar amounts of money, very similar to the Adelsons, with a very similar agenda, and they give their money very explicitly to the Democratic Party in exchange for their loyalty to Israel as well. From the New York Times in September of 2004, it was a profile on the mogul Haim Sabin, who is a billionaire who has funded much of the Democratic Party for decades. And the title of the article that was a profile of him was Schlepping to Moguldom. Quote, a self-described cartoon schlepper, Mr. Sabin became a billionaire by turning the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers into a global franchise that he merged with Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and in 2001 sold to the Walt Disney Company for $5.3 billion. He has since emerged as perhaps the most politically connected mogul in Hollywood, throwing his weight and money around Washington and increasingly the world, trying to influence all things Israeli. Quote, I'm a one-issue guy, he said, and my issue is Israel. Mr. Sabin's views on the matter are straightforward. He is a tireless cheerleader for Israel, but when it comes to conflict there, his views are hardly sanguine. Quote, I'm going to make a very controversial statement, and I hope to God that I am proven totally wrong. I think that any resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will have to go both on the Palestinian side and Israeli side to some form of civil war. It's not going to be without spilling blood. To that end, he has become one of the largest individual donors in the country to the Democratic Party and its candidates, giving millions over the past decade. $7 million in just one donation to the DNC in 2002. He recently had Senator John Kerry over to his chateau-style home in Beverly Hills. Quote, "We played guitar and kibbutz," he said. He regularly spends hours at a time on the phone with Ariel Sharon, the Israeli prime minister, back in 2004. He vacations with Bill Clinton. So although I'm profiling and asking the question of who is Miriam Adelson and what does she want from the Republican Party and Donald Trump, with the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that she spends every election cycle, the Democrats have exactly the same incentives, exactly the sort of same financiers as their biggest donor for over the past couple of decades. Chaim Saban says, "I'm a one-issue guy and my issue is Israel." So obviously that money comes with the same strings attached, which is the Democratic Party serve and be aligned with and loyal to the interest of Israel. And that's why you see this bipartisan consensus on this question. And looking at the people who cause this and who generate it and engender it and how they do that, I think is obviously something very important to do. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.